Hello and a very warm welcome to episode 29 of the Green Bean podcast. My name is Katie and my assistant Jack is not feeling in the mood to be on the camera right now, but you will definitely see him out on the moors in this episode. And we're both really glad that you're here, whether you're a new viewer, a very warm welcome to you, or a long-term viewer, welcome back. It has been a long time since I recorded a podcast episode, and I'm really glad to be back here and ready to share some creative projects with you again. For those who've been watching for a while, you may or may not know that the reason for my break from podcasting was because I had major surgery back in November last year, and I've been taking time off to rest and recuperate. And I'm still in a recovery process, so I'm not fully back to normal, whatever normal means, in 2021 and a global pandemic. But I'm well on the road to recovery and feeling much better than I did before the surgery, which was the whole idea. So it feels great to be back here and ready to share things with you. A few things that I want to share with you up front before we get started. My return to work has been happening gradually over the last few weeks, but I'm happy to share that my shop is now back open. So if you want to browse my illustrated goodies, print zines, comics, tea towels, that kind of thing, that's back open on Etsy. While I took a break, I also did a bit of spring cleaning and had a de-stash, and there are a few goodies, both yarn and fabric, still available in my de-stash shop, and I will put the link to those, both my main Etsy shop and my de-stash, down below. If you missed me while I was away and you weren't aware, I do also have a Patreon to support this podcast. It's patreon.com/KatieGreenbean. And there you can find extra episodes, vlogs, all kinds of extra goodies. And I actually pretty much shared a video almost every week with patrons while I was away. So if you missed those, there's quite a lot of extra content for you to catch up over there. I also share an extra episode in between every one that goes out on YouTube. There's an extra episode that gets shared with patrons only. So there's loads of bonus content for you there if you miss me between one episode and the next. But without further ado, let's get started and dive into this episode. I've got some drawing to share with you, some knitting, a very exciting sewing project that I cannot wait to share, and a bit of mending as well. And of course, a walk out on Dartmoor with my lovely puppy Jack. And that feels really special this time because during my recovery, I was not able to walk Jack. So the surgery that I had was a hysterectomy, a full abdominal hysterectomy. So I had a lot of rest and recovery to do while I regained my strength. And that meant that I couldn't do any lifting or the things that were like pulling around, challenging those abdominal muscles. And one of those things is walking a small terrier. However small he might be, he is strong and he does pull on that lead. So it was a real celebration to get to be able to walk him again. And this walk that we recorded is actually the very first time that I took him for the whole of the walk. I'd been building it up gradually, my partner walking Jack, and then me taking a little turn here and there. But this walk that I'm going to share with you is the first time that I took charge of Jack all the way around. So it really feels like a celebration. And along with that, I'm just so happy to be back and looking forward to sharing my creative projects with you. Whenever I've had a break from drawing for a while, I always find it takes me a little bit of practice and exercise, I guess, to reflex those muscles and get back into the rhythm of things. And definitely the longer the break, the more difficult it is to find that flow again. So over the years, I've kind of developed a way back in that seems to work for me quite reliably, which is always to begin with a self-portrait. And that kind of works on many different levels, because often if I've had a break from drawing, it's been because I've been ill or there have been various life changes going on, for example, major surgery. And as a result of that, I come back to drawing with a different kind of sense of myself and feeling like I want to express myself a bit differently. So a self-portrait always seems like a good place to start. And this time in particular, it feels important because I obviously look quite different. I've lost a fair bit of hair since my last self-portrait. And I'm feeling very different in myself in terms of the outcome of the surgery and how I'm feeling about my own identity. So it felt really good to think about working on a new self-portrait that would express that. And I've actually been working on it for quite a few weeks already. If you follow me on Instagram or you support on Patreon, you will have seen some of this work in progress. And I've taken footage of all the different stages of the drawing, and you can see it on my drawing table here, almost finished. I'm going to finish it off on camera for you today. So what I've done so far is started with a blank sheet of watercolour paper. I then sketched the design in pencil first, inked it with my black Pigma Micron pen to mark all the outlines and shapes, that kind of thing. I then added washes of colour with my coloured inks, and I do that over several layers, letting them dry in between so the layers don't bleed into each other unless I want them to. I quite like that effect of bleeding colours in the backgrounds and for landscapes, that kind of thing. But obviously I don't want that to happen on more defined parts of the image, like my face and Jack's face, that kind of thing. So that stage is all done. I've finished all of the coloured inks, and all that remains to do really is I just like to use a bit of coloured pencil to define certain features, some of the light and shadow, to really make the image kind of leap forward. And there are some finer details that I can get with coloured pencil that I can't get with the inks, and also more intense colours. So that's the bit of the portrait I'll be finishing today, and then it will be done. So as you can probably see from the selection here on my table, I do not have a particular brand of coloured pencil that I favour. I have quite a hodgepodge of a collection that I've accumulated over many years from what has happened to be available in the nearest art shop at any given time. So I don't have a particular preference that I like, but I do have particular colours that I go through more often than others, which won't be a surprise to you. It's mostly greens and browns. Those are the colours that most often crop up in my artwork and in my wardrobe. So it makes sense that those would be the coloured pencils that I pick up the most often. But in this drawing, I'm probably mostly going to be using shades of grey because I want to pick up details in these rocks and some of the vegetation, so greys and greens for shadows, just to define the difference between the figure and the landscape, so that I don't disappear into the background, I guess. The knitting project I want to share in this episode is one that I think you will have seen before because I cast it on last summer, and then I put the project down, not because there was any problem with it. Usually my knitting projects get put aside if there's some kind of problem that I don't want to deal with, so I put them in the naughty corner until I feel strong enough to cope with it. But this one got put aside mostly because I was working on a new design and just distracted. But I was inspired during my recovery to pick the project up again, and I'm really happy to have it back on the needles and swiftly progressing towards becoming a wearable garment. And it is the Caledonia jumper by Sylvia Watts-Cherry. You can see here, that's the top of the jumper and this beautiful cable pattern on the body. I just love it. So it looks more finished than it is. I decided after finishing the two body pieces that I would seam them together and do the neckband. Because I don't know about you, but when it comes to garment making, the sleeves are always a sticking point. And I thought if I put the body together and, could see how close this garment was to being finished, that might motivate me to not get distracted and avoid knitting those sleeves. So that's the plan, is that I'm going to have an almost finished garment here to spur me on and get those sleeves done. So what I'm doing right now is just picking up the stitches around the neck for the neckband. So this jumper is knitted flat from the bottom up. So I started with the front piece and I recently finished the back piece. They've both been blocked before I seamed them together. And how can I explain? I am working at a different gauge than given in the pattern because I chose a very specific yarn that I wanted to use for this jumper, which is a DK blend of Gotland and Bluefaced Leicester, naturally dyed, that I purchased from Nellie Eve. It's been dyed with nettles and it's this beautiful kind of greyish green colour. I love it, and I knew that I wanted it to be this Caledonia jumper because it would show off the textured stitches so nicely. But after doing my swatch, I didn't get the recommended gauge from the pattern, but I also didn't want to try and get the right gauge because I was so happy with the drape and feel of the fabric that I'd got. So instead I decided to rejig the pattern and make a slightly different size so that I would end up with the right size with my smaller gauge. That was a terrible explanation, but I hope you know what I mean. So I'm following the instructions for the third size, and I expect that the finished jumper I come out with will be reasonably similar to the second size given in the pattern. That's the plan. And that's another reason for sewing these two pieces together before working the sleeves, was to make sure that my plan was working out and that they do indeed fit me as I'm hoping. And they do, so it's good news. All in all, it's going pretty well, and I'm really pleased with how this jumper is looking. Now, the one modification that I've made that comes to mind as I'm picking up these stitches, it's only a very, very small detail, but it's worth mentioning because the pattern has you, when you're shaping the front and the back neck, it has you place the centre stitches for the neckband on hold, but cast off the stitches at the side of the neck. And instead of placing them on hold, I actually cast them off. And that's just a personal preference because I find it provides a more sturdy edge for the neckband. I quite like my jumpers to be quite high around the neck and close fitting, and I don't want them to stretch out too much. So it's something that I find really helps, is having a cast off there before you pick up for the ribbing, rather than picking up live stitches. It just takes away a little bit of the stretch, and for me I find that makes the neckband a bit more sturdy. So that's the only modification I've made to this jumper, and that's a big deal because the jumper has you do twisted rib, and I'm not even talking about half twisted rib where you twist the knit stitches but knit the purl stitches plain. Now, this is fully twisted rib where you knit the knit stitches through the back loop and you purl the purl stitches through the back loop, and that is absolutely not my favourite way of working rib at all. I find it very uncomfortable on my hands, and so it's a measure of love for Sylvia the designer and the beauty of this design that I wanted to create the jumper that looks exactly like her sample, that I was willing to go through that twisted rib, because it's not my favourite process. And I'm very aware that as I pick up these stitches for the neckband, I have some more twisted rib ahead of me, but it's all going to be fine. It's going to be worth it. It's really going to be a beautiful jumper, and it's definitely going to fit. It's going to feel right at home in my wardrobe. It's going to go with everything. There are two things that I love about adding a mending segment to my podcast, and the first of those is that it makes me do some mending. Mending is not my favourite activity. I don't know why I avoid it, because it's incredibly satisfying to pull out a favourite make and give it a new lease of life, but for some reason those little jobs are the ones I always avoid. So since I started including a mending segment in the podcast, it just means that I sit down and I actually pick out something to mend. But the other reason I love including it is it gives me a reason to revisit old makes and share them with you and show you how they're wearing after however long it is that they've taken to need a mend. And the jumper I've pulled out today is one that you've actually seen me mend before. It's my Humulus jumper by Isabel Kraemer that I knitted, I'm going to say about 3 years ago. It's made with Garthenor organic yarns in 2 different natural shades, both of which are blends of breeds. That's a mouthful. Blends of breeds. The main colour is a blend of Hebridean and Manx, and the contrast colour is a blend of Manx and Chen. And I love this jumper. I wear it all the time. The yarns have worn incredibly well. As you can see, there's not a pill to be seen on this jumper. It looks as good as the day I made it, if not better. The mending that I've done previously has been to the cuff had unravelled where I'd worn it around my wrists, so I mended that. And the mend that I'm going to do today is on the elbow. As you can see, the elbow is getting very, very threadbare, so I'm going to be adding a darned patch over that to bring this jumper back to life. And luckily, because I am the kind of person who chronically over purchases yarn rather than under purchases, I've almost always got some of the same yarn left over. Actually, I had so much of this yarn left over that I managed to knit a toy dog out of it for my nephew, and I still have some left, probably enough for another project as well as repairs. So I'm going to be darning over this in the original yarn. And that's it. Once that's done, I think I only need to do one elbow today. The second elbow is, for some reason, not suffering as much as the first one. So I just have one elbow patch to do, and then this jumper can go back into its heavy rotation as usual. Now I want to introduce you to my big green plastic darning needle, because I have friends who make fun of me for using such a cute and brightly coloured piece of equipment, but it is my absolute favourite darning needle, and I don't know why it is that I love it so much. Obviously it's green, so that is probably part of it, but I love the fact that I can see it when I'm working, no matter what colour of yarn I'm working with. It's pretty bright, so it shows up nicely. I also like that it's a little bit flexible, unlike a metal needle, which makes, I don't know, something about that makes it more fun to work with, both for sewing up seams and for darning. And I think it shows up what I'm doing quite nicely when I'm filming. So there are lots of reasons for using my nice bright green needle, even if it does look a little bit childish and silly. It's still my favourite needle. cannot quite believe that I am sitting here about to show you what I think is probably my greatest sewing achievement ever. And long-term viewers will know the significance because I have been battling with making a pair of trousers for myself for many, many years. It's been a long and painful process for many reasons, but somehow here I am sewing the buttonhole on a brand new pair of trousers, which you probably can't see because they're green corduroy and I'm wearing green corduroy. So I make sure that I'll pop some close-ups in for you to see the details of these trousers because I am so incredibly proud of them. So long story short, and it is a long story because this has been a process of about 6 different trouser muslins over several years to try and get to this point. This pair of trousers is half drafted myself and half based on a Burda pyjama pattern that I've covered in previous episodes, and I'll pop the name of the pattern down below because I can't remember it off the top of my head. But I made several pairs of those pyjamas last year and I was really happy with the shape of them, and that's half the battle for me with trousers, is feeling comfortable in the shape of them. Obviously the pyjamas were made from jersey, so they were stretchy and they had an elasticated waistband. So in order to be able to make them from woven fabric, I had some adaptations to do. So what I did was I cut the same pattern out of calico, which is like my test cheap fabric that I sew toiles from. And I sewed the side seams together and assembled a fly. I didn't put a zip in, I just pinned it. And the crotch seam, put them on, and obviously they were huge around the waist because that would have been gathered by the elastic in the pyjamas. And instead of gathering the waist, I draped on my body pleats at the front and darts at the back. And that's how I ended up with a muslin for a pair of trousers that fitted. Once I had those pleats and darts pinned in place, I popped on a waistband and miraculously ended up with a pair of trousers that were just the right fit for me. And I'm so pleased to have got to this point. I can't tell you how rewarding it feels after many years of very bad failures and challenging failures. So one of the reasons that trousers are difficult for me is not just because trousers are difficult to sew and to fit, but because there are complications with my history. I'm a survivor of both eating disorders and sexual assault, and trousers bring up a lot of difficult memories for me and feelings around that. So it's been a huge part of my recovery journey as well as my sewing journey to be able to make a pair of trousers. So on many levels this is a hugely significant and meaningful project, and I'm incredibly proud of them. So to show you some of the finishing details, which is what I'm really pleased with about this pair of trousers, they have pockets at the front, obviously, there's no point in having trousers without pockets. They also have welt pockets at the back, which I am so proud of. That was a new technique to me. I've never tried a welt pocket before. I did practice the welt pocket on a piece of scrap fabric first, so I wasn't just trying this new technique on my precious trousers that I had spent so many hours working on. But still, it was really scary to cut a slice into the back of my real trousers when it came to putting those pockets in. But I'm incredibly pleased with how they look. They're really smart, and now I just want to put welt pockets in everything because they're very satisfying to make and not as terrifying as I thought they would be. Still terrifying, but not as terrifying. So as you can see, there's a contrast fabric inside the pockets, both at the back and at the front, and also on the waistband facing. That fabric is actually from an old skirt of mine. It's a Liberty fabric from one of the first sewing projects that I made, just a basic gathered skirt with a fitted waistband and a zip. that had been in my mending box for about 100 years, because that's how long things stay in my mending box. I think I'd only worn it once or twice, and a certain small dog got very excited and somehow ended up with the skirt in his teeth and ripped a massive slice out of the front of it. So it wasn't wearable, and I wasn't sure how to fix it because it was Liberty Lawn fabric, so it was very, very fine, and I couldn't think of a way of repairing that tear without adding something to stabilise the fabric, which would have meant that the skirt didn't drape and flow like it was meant to. So it just stayed in the box, and I'm really glad to have been able to recycle that fabric from one of my early sewing projects into one of my most proud and significant sewing projects. It feels really good to have that reminder of my sewing journey in my trousers. So that's it. All that now remains between me and the finished pair of trousers is one buttonhole and 3 buttons. Obviously 1 at the front to close the fly, and 2 at the back for my welt pockets. And right now what I'm doing is hand finishing or hand sewing the buttonhole at the front. And I'm doing that because this thick fabric here, double thickness of corduroy with interfacing, my sewing machine just said, nope, I'm not putting a buttonhole in that. So I'm doing it by hand. I would always much rather do my buttonholes by machine, but I didn't have a choice. So again, this is another new technique for me, which I did, which I learned following a YouTube tutorial, which I'll link to down below. I'm just using some top stitching thread, so it's nice and strong, and stitching around this buttonhole. I'm about halfway there, and then all I need to do is add a couple of buttons and these trousers are ready to go. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Green Bean podcast. I hope you enjoyed hearing about what I've been up to and seeing a bit of Dartmoor and the beautiful landscape around where I live. Thank you as well to Will McNicol, whose wonderful guitar music accompanies all of my episodes. I'm so grateful to Will for letting me use his music. I just think it's the perfect match for my work, so I hope you enjoy getting to listen to him play while you see me about my various projects. As I said at the beginning, if you want to catch me between now and the next episode, the best place to do so is on Patreon. That's patreon.com/KatieGreenbean. And you can also find me on Instagram as @KatieGreenbean. That's all for now, but I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Take care and thank you so much for watching. Bye.